Painting and Travel visits Hulett, Wyoming, where Sarah talks with artist Bob Coronato about his collection of Indian artifacts, and Roger uses acrylics to paint a pair of beaded Souix moccasins from the 1890s.
Pretty good. Hi, I'm so glad you could join us. This is artist Bob Coronato, and we're standing in the museum section of his gallery. This is a fascinating room. It has museum quality artifacts, both of cowboys and American Indian. The collection is incredible, and I know that you have a couple of favorites.
Most of the time, that's the fun for me, is I like to search out and see if I can find a historical piece of American Indian or cowboy.
Did it start off as a hobby?
Yeah, it started off as a hobby that became an addiction that got out of control. So I have my gallery, which I tend to look for things American Indian and cowboy related. It always inspires me, even though my artwork is contemporary. Being around historical items always inspires me.
We've had a lot of fun looking around.
Yeah, there's a lot of neat items.
And speaking of neat items, what do you have here?
What we have here is it's a Lakota war shirt. And after I found it, I displayed it, and I had an approximate date, and this gal came in from the reservation, Autumn Two Bulls, and she asked me if she could do a beadwork interpretation. She said she could tell me more about the shirt and possibly the shirt wearer. In their culture, the back of the shirt is the most prominent part because your exploits or your bragging rights, so to speak, are on your back instead of on the front.
This is the back of the shirt.
Back. Yeah. And so what she said was, she said she could tell it was Lakota and Teton because it had the big mountain designs there, and that's the house of the Teton. And then she said that the hand gesture for the Black Hills is the sign there, which looks like a crescent moon, but it's actually laying down, so that would be the Black Hills. And she said she was puzzled by the star because they don't have a 5-pointed star, they use a 4-pointed star, and the 4-pointed star is the morning star. And since it was blue and it had 5 points, she felt that it meant cavalry, and since it's over the Black Hills, she thought that the wearer was saying, I met cavalry or killed cavalry over by the Black Hills.
And lived through it.
Right.
And was able to have a design put on my shirt to
show
tell
off
a story.
And tell it, yep.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and so that kind of gives a really neat insight into just the beadwork that might seem like just a pattern.
Take a look at this. It's a crow elk tooth dress.
This is one of my favorites. It's a little elk tooth dress, about 1890. The elk teeth, the only North American animal with ivory, the eye teeth of an elk, they would take the ivories, make them into beads, and affix them to the wool dress.
They're beautiful. They're shiny. They do look like ivory.
Yeah, and the Crow people still today, as they make their dresses, use the elk ivories. And I was just up there not too long ago, and it's amazing to see the dances. And they have a big, large teepee camp of over 1,500 teepees that they set up every year.
Oh, that must be a sight.
Oh, it's amazing to see.
Now, this little dress, is this for a special occasion?
It's just a traditional dress for any kind of formal occasion or ceremony or dances that they do.
I see you have a few other artifacts in there, and I've noticed the use of porcupine quills.
Yeah, they would take porcupine quills and flatten them and dye them and use those to weave and make designs on their dresses and clothes, and they still use them today. On this particular bag, the top part is woven quills, and in the bottom they're actually wrapped around a stiff hide, and that would be a tobacco bag, which would be for carrying tobacco for a pipe.
I see. And men and women smoked pipes?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Ooh, these are lovely.
That's a pair of crow moccasins from about 1860, 1870.
And these are made of something very soft. What is that?
That's Indian tanned or brain tanned hide. They tan it with the brains of the animal, so it's called Indian tanned hide, and then it was smoked to make it waterproof.
Smoked to make it waterproof.
Mm-hmm.
And then has lovely bead design. And these are the tiny beads. Is it seed beads?
Those are seed beads, yep. And they're sewn down with sinew, which is the tendon of the animal.
Oh, these are really lovely. About what age do you think these are?
About 1860, 1870.
1860 or 1870. How beautiful. I feel very lucky to have touched them. Thanks, Bob. This has really been a lovely visit. I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Today I'm going to paint another pair of moccasins owned by Bob Coronato, but these are from the Sioux Indian tribe from around 1890. I'll be using an 11 by 14 inch piece of masonite covered with gesso, and I've drawn the moccasins on here, and I'm working from a photograph. Now the shoes in the photograph were right together like this. I've spread them out somewhat just to make a slightly better composition. I'll be using acrylics today, and I have quite a bit of colors out on my palette, including titanium white, ultramarine blue, cerulean blue, Indian yellow, cadmium yellow light, cadmium red light, alizarin crimson. I have a sap green and 3 earth colors, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and burnt umber. I may not use all these colors, but when I'm in the studio, I generally have more colors out on my palette than when I'm painting in the field. I'm going to take a large brush and just put in some background color. Often I tone the entire board with a burnt sienna color, but in this case, I've got so many light areas here, I just decided to leave the board white and start out by not having a tone in the moccasins themselves. So I'm going to cut around them. I think I'll spray my board. This is a very important piece of equipment to have when painting with acrylics. A sprayer keeps my paint wet, but mostly it allows me to slide the paint over this board much easier and much quicker if this is a little damp. I'm using ultramarine blue, burnt sienna. Just put this tone in here. I have to be careful not to put too much texture in here because the shoes themselves have some beautiful texture, and I don't ever want my background to compete with my subject. Okay, that's a fairly even background there. It's got fairly even texture on it. And while that's drying, I'll take another brush, fairly large brush here, and I'll take some of these earth colors, my yellow ochre, touch of burnt sienna, and I'll put the leather parts in of this shoe. Maybe I think I need some white on there. The lighter parts of the moccasin here, they're white, but of course I'm not going to use white. I'm going to dip into my background color here, which is a very neutral color, and I'll make those dark to start with, not terribly dark. Now the reason I want this a darker color than the white is I want to be able to place those white beads over this darker color. That way the white beads will show up. And here we have the same thing going. This swoops around to the front. Now all these designs and patterns on there, I'm not going to worry about cutting around them. I'll just paint right over them, but the paint is thin enough where I can see my drawing underneath. Painting shoes, it's always difficult. Often you paint a pair of shoes and it turns out looking like a couple of potatoes. But I don't think I'll have that issue on these shoes because these are so distinctive with all this beadwork and so on. Sap green and cadmium yellow light will make a very vibrant green, but I'm going to put some burnt umber in that to begin with. These lines right here are just some lines I put in describing the way the beads flow off the moccasin, the direction they flow off the moccasin. Now these colors in no way represent the colors of the finished shoe, but I want to lay these dark colors in first so I can put the light colors over them so these beads will show up nicely. And I'm just using a large brush on this. And within this area here, it gets quite dark. I think maybe a slightly smaller brush will do the trick on that. Ultramarine blue, burnt umber, that will make me a very dark neutral color. By using more burnt umber than ultramarine blue, I'll keep this a nice warm tone down in here. Now there's no texture that goes on in these dark areas, so I'm putting this on and brushing it out just so I don't see any texture down in there. I don't want a lot of texture in here like I have on this lighter part of the leather. These particular moccasins were worn by Claire McDowell, who was an early silent film actress, and she probably wore these in one of her films where she played an American Indian woman. Movie companies often bought the real items like these moccasins because they were easy to find instead of having to make them. And many of the old westerns had real guns, beadwork, blankets, and moccasins like these. A lot of these items that are considered treasures today were found in old movie prop houses. This area of paint right up here is dry already. Since it's acrylics, it dries almost instantly, especially on a masonite board. But this is still wet. So with a dry brush, I'll wipe this brush off slightly, and I'll just drag some of these dark areas up into these lighter areas, and it gives the impression that those two colors are blended together. Even though you can't blend a dry color with a wet color, by just pushing that up there, it will give that impression. Gives the same look. Basically what I'm doing is putting a glaze over this. And if I were using oils, I would have to wait a long time in order to put a glaze over something. I'd have to wait till it dries totally, but with the acrylics, they just dry fast, and that's really one of the nice advantages of using acrylics. If you haven't used acrylics and would like to, and you can get past the frustration of learning a new medium, there are some great advantages in using acrylics. I use them on the road all the time because when I travel or paint out on location, there's really no drying time involved, and I don't have that fear of transporting a wet oil painting. One of my goals always is to get the canvas covered, or get the board covered, and not leave any areas untouched. With my ultramarine blue and burnt umber, I'm going to put a shadow right under these moccasins. I'll spray that with my atomizer. I'll wipe my brush off, dry it off some, and then I'll just drag that wet paint into the dry paint here to create that shadow. This background is totally dry, so it's easy to work with. It's easy to paint over it. Now this background being dry, if I don't like it, I can do a couple of things with it. I can either paint over it completely, or I can put a glaze over it. So that gives me a couple of options to keep changing things around with the acrylics. And now it's a matter of studying my reference photograph more closely and putting in detail, just building it up a little at a time. I'll put another darker wash in the back of these moccasins here where it's in shadow. I'm going to use the edge of my brush here and push this around because I don't want to lose any of that texture on the leather. Now, these moccasins themselves were made from buffalo hide. I'm almost treating this as if it were a watercolor today. I'm using thinner paint on this than I usually do. Now, if I were working on a canvas, I probably wouldn't work quite as thin because anything painted on canvas needs more body to it to look like a good painting. But since I'm working on this masonite, it really doesn't matter quite as much. Every once in a while, I'll take my atomizer, spray my paints here. I'll keep them wet longer on my palette. Here's where the tongue of these moccasins folds over. So there'll be a nice highlight right on the top and right along the edge of these moccasins. We have a very light area. I'm not even using a pointed brush on this. I'm just using, I got a good brush here and it's got a nice chisel edge to it. So I can just use the edge of that. And I don't necessarily need a pointed brush to do a small thin line. Here there's another darker shadow. This is dry already, this dark green. Well, I'm picking up a small pointed brush now. I'm really not sure which method is best to use to put in these beads, but we'll try this small pointed brush. With the titanium white, I'll mix it with this color here of the yellow ochre and burnt sienna to make a warm tone. It's just kind of trial and error. I think I'm just going to have to load my brush up, quite a bit of paint on the edge of that brush, and just dab these little beads on there one at a time. Now here's where there was an advantage in making these areas here darker to begin with, because now these beads are going to show up. I think I can do this fairly quickly. I'm not counting beads here. I'm just trying to follow the form of the shoe and just go down the row. It's kind of fun. It's not really tedious at all to put these in here because this just dabbing the brush slightly against the board here places enough paint on there to make these look like little beads, little seed beads. Now over on the edge here, these tend to sort of get lost, so I don't have to do each one of these beads as accurately. In other words, you can't see all these beads as individual beads here on the side. Maybe a few more pure white touches right along here. Now let's move over to the shoe on the left, and we'll do the same thing. I can still see my pencil lines very faintly through here. First few beads I put on here, I'm a little more cautious. And as I put more beads on here, get a little more relaxed, and goes even quicker. Here again, there's some beads on the side of this shoe, and they sort of blend together, so I don't have to indicate each of those beads. These are called seed beads, but that doesn't mean they're made out of seeds. It's a generic term, and the beads probably came from Italy or Bohemia through trade routes and eventually ended up on the Western Plains through fur traders or trading posts. Claire McDowell, who owned these shoes, was in about 350 movies. That's a lot of movies. I think a lot of movies back then were very short, too, silent films. Okay, we've got one more row of white beads down here. Here again on the sides of these moccasins, I can't see each individual bead quite so well, so I'll just quickly make an indication of them. And here is the second row of the beads. There's two rows, one on the top here, one on the bottom. Now we have the light green beads. So I'll take some white cadmium yellow light and some of my sap green, and I think some cerulean blue. I'm just looking at my reference photo there. I'm trying to get this color as close as I can. I'll vary these colors too as the beads go around the shoe, just because it's being hit by a little bit different light here and there. Now I want to be able to flow the pattern of these beads as they wrap around the edge of the moccasin. So what I'm doing here is I'm laying out a pattern of where these beads go. So I can do that just here and there, then I can just fill in between those. Here these beads fall off rather quickly around the edge of the moccasin, and here they go out and down. It's sort of like building ribs on a boat. You build the ribs and then I can fill in the rest of it easily because I already know where the rest of the beads are going to go. So now it's just a matter of filling in the blanks, filling in the spaces. And once again, painting this dark area here really helps me out to let these beads show up. If I didn't paint that dark underneath, if I'd have left that white, it would have been much harder. And of course with oils too, it would have been much harder, because if I were using oils, this would have been still wet. But here, this color here is totally dry. So now I can place these beads over that in the light color beads won't mix with the dark color underneath. I'm not picking up my brush very much between each of these small dots, just sort of letting it dance along the canvas, just sort of a little up and down motion. Now I'll just fill in between these guidelines I have. That way I'll know I'm heading in the right direction as far as the contour of the shoe. Okay, now back here towards the back side of the shoe, it's in shadow, so I'm going to make these beads darker. Okay, wash the brush out. We'll pick up some of a warm color with some cadmium red light and a touch of alizarin crimson. And here we have that beautiful design with some red beads. And down here on the toe of the moccasin, the same thing. Over here on this shoe, we've got the design repeated. Get a little more comfortable putting these beads in as I go along. Ultramarine blue and burnt umber will give me this dark color again. And we have the beads here that create this cross. And one up here on the top of the moccasin. And down here on the side. Well, these are starting to look like moccasins now. We'll add some detail with these shoelaces and some hard edges here and there to bring it out. I'll load my brush up with this light color of yellow ochre and white, and I'll place in these shoelaces. Now these shoelaces won't show up much right now, but I think they will when I add some dark colors underneath them. Just loading my brush up, putting quite a bit of paint on the tip of my brush so it flows off the end of the brush. And the shoelace coming off here. And one goes around the side. It goes through the buffalo hide and around the back. And right there is where it ties the two together. It goes through the buffalo hide. We'll accentuate that in a few moments. Now I'll mix up more of a dark color with my ultramarine blue and burnt umber. And right around where these shoelaces are, they cast a shadow. And this is what will bring out the shoelaces so they can be seen better. Got a shadow under most all these shoelaces, but I want that shadow to be somewhat soft. So after I put that shadow on there, I'll just drag this down this area here and make that shadow slightly soft. I don't want a real hard edge on that shadow. Pretty hard, but not terribly hard. If I spray that with some water, when I put this shadow on here, it will automatically soften itself out. The water will let that edge flow out somewhat. Right up here, the tongue of this moccasin folds over and comes back down under these laces. Let's get back to these beads once again. They need some highlights here and there. So with my white and yellow, I'll make a lighter tone, and I'm going to highlight a few of these beads on the edge of the shoe where it's catching more light. And that might give the moccasin more form. And down on this side here, we'll make a darker yellow. Maybe I'll pick up the Indian yellow right now and make that darker green. In this transition area between the green and the white beads, it gets darker. So we'll accentuate that. That might give that more of a folded look right in that area. Same right up here where this transition is with the beads. Gets darker. Here we have another transition right between these rows of white beads. So I'll make a dark color here with burnt umber and ultramarine blue. And I'll just touch in with kind of a dry brush this transition where these two sets of beads go. Right down the middle. And I have one more transition where the beads come right down the middle here, because there's two sets of beads, one on each side here of the white. With some more dark color, I'm going to spray my board. And I want to get rid of some of this texture in the background. There's such interesting texture here in the shoe. Some of this background texture here is, I believe, fighting with the shoe itself. Grab a large brush for that. Now I'm putting some white in this because I want to cover some of this texture and eliminate some of the texture underneath here. And white is opaque, so that's going to get rid of some of that texture. If I were to just use transparent colors on that background, I could get it darker, but the texture would still show. So white being opaque lets me cover up that texture. And while I'm at it, I'll take the dark color, put a bit more of a shadow on this side. Put a good amount of paint on there. I'll wipe the brush off, and then I'll just drag some of that value out here and give it a soft edge. Maybe put a longer shadow on there. Okay, well, a few more highlights on a few of these beads. Make them a bright green. I'm flattening out this background quite a bit, getting rid of a lot of the texture here. Accent a few of these beads on the front, and I think that should finish this painting. By painting these moccasins, which is a bit of an unusual subject for me, I've learned to appreciate the beauty and the craftsmanship that's gone into them.
For more information about painting and travel with Roger and Sarah Bansemer, visit paintingandtravel.com.